Welcome to another edition of Sharpe Takes. I'm delighted today to have a guest who spent most of his career as the executive director of the Vermont School Boards Association. Jeff Francis is in the process of retiring, a recent retiree from that position, and has seen dramatic changes in and participated in development of education in Vermont over the last 30 years. So welcome, Jeff. I'm delighted to have you on the program.
I'm delighted to be here.
All right. You were a great partner in my work on the Education Committee with Act 46 and 173, and even developing the weighting study, I think, was the last thing we did. So you've seen a lot. Because of the last election and the pain that people were feeling with regard to paying taxes, or at least the misinformation that went out convincing people that the problem was school taxes, now that's up for discussion. And so I'd like your take on where we are today, how we got here, where we want to go, and how we're going to get there.
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here, number one. I agree with you. When you were in the General Assembly and as chair of the Education Committee, I thought you did wonderful work in terms of the public purpose of public education and what we should do to improve it. So thank you for your service there. The context for me really starts with my professional background, which prior to working as the executive director of the Superintendent's Association, I served for 9 years as a town administrator, first in Hinsdale, New Hampshire, and then in Rockingham and Bellows Falls, Vermont. Both of those are working class towns. And my commitment as a public servant in those capacities was always to give taxpayers the best value possible for their dollar. So the current conversation in education about taxation and value resonates with me because my value is to do as well as we can in terms of economy and efficiency while meeting our public purpose. I also think that public education is, in fact, the bedrock of an American society and democracy. So the passion that I felt during your work as a legislator and over the entirety of my career, and even sitting here today, really goes to the benefits of public education and how we do that in the most economic and efficient manner. And as you point out, that is the discussion that's going on right now. It doesn't always take that form, but fundamentally it's like, how do you give taxpayers value and have a public education system that delivers for the students that it serves and the communities that benefit from it? In terms of where we are right now, to be frank, I have seen this coming for a long time. My professional and personal belief is that we need to manage within a finite amount of resources, and I think that the evolved construct of the education funding system in Vermont, as well as all of the policy that fuels it, has brought us to a point where it's understandable that the public would be frustrated with the taxes that they pay for public education, because for most people, public education is a personal context, what they have experienced themselves, what their kids experience. What I think we've seen in Vermont, because the education fund is a fund that is self-leveling, as it were, is we've seen a lot of additive initiatives that affect the cost of education. On the one hand, we have no shortage of aspirations in terms of what we want to do educationally, and we're dealing in a political environment where, and a practical environment where everything costs a lot. So we'll have a conversation today about public education. you could have guests, if you decided to, who would come in and talk about healthcare, or the investments that we have made or haven't made in the physical infrastructure. Vermont is a state which has, as you know, it's the 14th state. It's got a long, long history in terms of its culture and communities. We have tremendously progressive aspirations in terms of our policies. And I think that we've reached a point, and I know that there's, many, many people who agree that affordability is an issue. So the question is, how do you contend with affordability? And I think that the level set that we're going through right now is absolutely necessary. I think it's really challenging, and it's fueled with a lot of political dynamic, which makes it really, really hard to tackle. And what do I think is going to happen? What should happen? It's a complicated question because the political context that informs these deliberations goes well beyond just our public education system. It goes into a highly dynamic political construct and a state that, in my opinion, really wants to hang on to a value set which is based on small scale public participation, maintaining sort of the imagery that Vermont is. And what I've seen over the 28 years that I was executive director were a lot of progressive, small p, progressive interests to improve the system that were heavily deliberated and debated by people who, frankly, didn't want to make some changes.
So let's go back in terms of education finance for a minute.
Yep.
So the Brigham decision, the Vermont Supreme Court found that communities were unable to provide enough funding for their students from one community to another, from a poor, property value poor community to a property rich community.
Right.
And so therefore the Brigham decision, left it to the legislature, or charged the legislature with fixing it. They came up with this notion of Act 60, which created a pool of money that was designed to, and I think it has, correct me if you think I'm wrong, has leveled the field to a certain extent so that property wealthy communities have ended up paying their fair share, so to speak, enabling property poor communities to deliver better services to their children. There exists, however, still a difference in equity between different communities' ability to provide funding for their children. I think it's not so much property value in communities as it is income wealth. And so voters from income wealthier communities are more willing to raise money to educate children than those from income poor communities. So if that's a dynamic that's happening, and if we recognize that there still is a differential between what some communities are willing to spend on their children and other communities are not, are willing to spend more, I should say, that's brought us in part to where we are now. You lay on top of that the new weighting study, which in general I think has counted students in income wealthier because they have fewer low-income students and they have fewer students with a learning as second language. So those communities are ending up feeling the increase in tax rates more significantly. So that brings us to where we are today.
Right.
And Scott Beck, the new Republican leader in the Senate, has said, well, it's time to return to the foundation formula. partly because the weighting study made tax capacity available in some communities that were not spending much money on children.
Right.
And instead of spending more money on children and improving the education for those children in those communities, they took advantage of it as a tax break, which was not the idea of Brigham or Act 60. So maybe Act 60 has reached the end of its run. Another proposal on the table is from the Vermont NEA and the Public Assets Institute have collaborated to say let's move to an income-based system, which might address the same income inequality from one community to the other. What's your take on that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, there's so much to unpack there, and you covered a lot in your explanation. Act 60 at the outset was elegant in its simplicity, because essentially what it said, and this is a sort of a restatement of your explanation, it said that rather than have just the property tax base of a community behind the education of students in that community, the property tax base of the entire state goes behind every student in the state. And in theory, the notion was that that's equalizing. Act 60 didn't say how much you had to spend, whereas a foundation formula starts with that, how much you have to spend. It simply said the ability to raise dollars is going to be a statewide obligation, not a local obligation. Also, as you said, the difference in mindset between communities that historically had lived with less access to resource didn't change overnight. In fact, it hasn't changed over time. Until this most recent couple of years where it's been difficult to see a school district budget pass in many communities in the state, I could predict on an annual basis which districts were going to defeat their school budgets. And, you know, there were 8 or 10 or 12 communities that spent less as the result of, I would say, the history and culture of those communities. When somebody advocates for a foundation formula, or they advocate for paying for education with income tax rather than a property tax, my personal belief is that those solutions are an effort to get past the current circumstance where everybody is feeling the pressure of the cost of education. My belief, and it existed when I was the executive director of the Superintendent's Association, and it exists today, is that while we should perhaps be adjusting the mechanisms around which we fund education, I really think we need to figure out a way to spend less. And the reason that I say that is because I don't think we can ignore the statistics that show we've got some of the highest investment per pupil in the country, and yet, arguably, we have the most deficient infrastructure. And factually, we pay our teachers about in the middle. So why is it that we spend among the higher amounts, depending on how you count, in the top 5 always in the country, but we've got an infrastructure which needs hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, and we have teachers who are being paid in the middle of the pack when we spend as much as we do per pupil? I think it's because we need to have some systems adjustment. And I think the systems adjustment have to focus on how we get as good or better a product, and we do it with less overhead costs. You know, when I was the executive director of the Superintendent's Association, I would read, and I read recently that, you know, our association, the Superintendent's Association, was really more interested in sustaining itself than they were in actually solving these problems. And it would usually be like, the Superintendent's Association wants to make sure that at the time we had 63 superintendents, we continue to have 63 superintendents. Just so happens that right now there are 52. So we've reduced that number. We have the lowest student to adult ratios, or second lowest in the nation. I think it's the lowest. It's either first or second. We maintain a huge number of physical facilities in an era, as we were talking about before the show started, where we need to become more reliant on technology for practically everything we do. I would never be an advocate to alter the culture of Vermont to change the scale away from small and personal and familiar, the things that so many Vermonters, including myself, value. But I think that if we're going to address the cost of education, we have to do things like decide to use more technology, to decide to get more efficient in the infrastructure, i.e. the number of schools we operate. We need to utilize personnel to provide high quality education, perhaps without having as many of those personnel as we have right now. So, yes, we can look at where the money comes from. We can look at the formula by which we apply that money. But if we don't change the cost structure, and neither the formula or the basis of the taxation change the cost structure, I think we have to change the cost structure.
All right. So that leads us obviously to how do we do that?
Right.
And so one of the things that is talked about is closing, I'll call them tiny schools,
Right.
rather than small schools. Maybe if you have fewer than 8 students per grade and you're within 5 miles of another elementary school, that school should close.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the high school level, should we have one high school per county with a technical center associated with that school? Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking?
I mean, so yes, it's the kind of thing that I'm thinking. I probably, if it were left to me, would not be that specific. When I look at the delivery of the public education system, I really see 3 important facets. I see management of the resource, I see governance of the resource, and I see the policies that inform the resource. And when I use the term resource, I mean it in the largest sense. The humans that contribute, the facilities that contribute. We've got an agency of education that relies on policies like school quality standards. There's a lot, and you know this from your work as a legislator, there's a lot that is prescribed to the education system that we want it to accomplish. You know, the approach I would take would be to rely on local control and local determination and the large numbers of people who want to contribute their intellectual capacity, their energy to the delivery system. And I would say, you know, we want to establish some targets for how we want to improve the cost structure. And we want to do it through management of the resources, governance of the resources, and the policies that inform the resources. I'm an advocate for letting the managers in the public education system, superintendents, principals, and others generate ideas for how they're going to get a better handle on costs. I'm an advocate of school boards being charged to slow the rate of growth in the annual year-over-year costs and make that a specific charge to them and say, these are the targets that we set. And I'm an advocate of working with policymakers both at the local and state level and say, we're not going to expand the mission of public education without, in the future, definitive resource allocations that are going to be used to pay for that expansion and not utilize the property tax to pay for it. So I'll give 3 examples. You're going to be familiar with all 3. You and I are both very familiar with Act 166, the pre-K legislation. Mm-hmm. Everybody supported it. I thought that you were among the legislators who had the more healthy skepticism of it because of the way the resource was being diluted. But when we made a decision as a state to expand education into the ranks of pre-K, that came with a cost that was additive and still is additive to the property tax.
Yeah.
That's an example. Similarly, when the General Assembly and the administration decided that we were going to have the most aggressive policy in the country around PCB mitigation of schools, that decision came with enormous cost without any real consideration for who was going to pay for the cost. Yeah. And a third, which is probably equally politically controversial in terms of its merits and how we pay for it. If you take a look at the legislation around universal school meals, you had a policy proposal that was probably the most laudable, at least in my career. We're going to make sure kids had the nutrition they needed, right? But there was no differentiation around the whether the household of those children from which they originated had the ability to pay or not. So, PCBs has tens of millions of dollars of obligation that occurred with no source of funding. The universal school meals came with about $30 million predicted at the time. It turned out to be less than that of cost obligation with no real source of funding. And to go further back, and I'm not picking on pre-K, I think that pre-K is great policy, but in order to educate young children at the level that we now feel they need to be educated when they're 3 and 4 year olds, that's expensive. And not only is that an expense which it contributes to the operation of the public institutions, the public schools, it's also money that's going to the birth to 3 side of the equation. So, it's maybe hard to follow for the viewers what I'm trying to say, but the point is you cannot continue to add obligation and not have the funding source to meet it other than property tax without relying on the property tax.
So I want to take you back to a statement you made. That is that let the managers figure out what's best in terms of not prescribing closures of schools or those kinds of mandates. In this county, in Addison County, the 3 superintendents were charged with doing. We want you to spend less. We want you to get costs under control.
Right.
All 3 of them proposed closing small elementary schools, and the community members in those towns that were projected to be closed were outraged, and they fought it tooth and nail. One school in this school district, one community left the school district and was going out on its own with, I think, 26 students in the school. And the state school board said, oh, no, you're going back in.
Right.
One school in another school district left the district, created its own district, and vouchered out its middle and high school students to private schools or public schools. In anywhere in the world, and a third town, the third district, did actually close one of its schools and consolidate its elementary students into schools. So, in that district, the Addison district, the Addison West district, is one that is still in the most jeopardy, I think, financially. So, having the leadership, the superintendents, charged with by their boards of improving education for the kids and bringing costs under control, did come forward with specific policies that the public just trashed.
Right. Yeah.
And so don't. The reason I bring all that up is, don't we need, and we sorely lack leadership at the state level of somebody saying, well, this is the way it's going to be. We will pay for the construction of high schools if it's centralized, one for the county, and it has a tech center associated with it. Otherwise, we're not going to pay for it.
Right.
Or some, I don't mean to be that specific necessarily, but some specific proposal coming out of leadership that says that's the way it's going to be.
Yeah, so those are really good points. The superintendents that you made reference to, you know, they find themselves in positions where they have to make recommendations like that.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what's going on right now with the Commission on the Future of Public Education. And we're going to see more of it when the General Assembly reconvenes. People are going to show up with ideas. And most often those ideas are very specific and don't always induce collaboration, right?
Oh, yeah.
So this challenge of the affordability of public education system is highly politicized.
Oh my goodness!
I mean,
yes.
we're already seeing it.
Megan Roy, in an interview with Vermont Digger just the other day, Mark Johnson referred to something as being the third rail of Vermont education.
Right.
And Megan's response was, there are many third rails.
Right.
And that's the problem with
That
putting
is-
forth any of these proposals, is
Right.
there is a constituency, a strong constituency that rises up in opposition
Right.
to any movement forward. So we
Right.
get stuck here.
I think we have to overcome that. My point, and it's overly simplistic, and it's probably highly debatable. You know, my belief is that the General Assembly should set targets for the rate of growth. They ought to be agreed to, hopefully by the administration at the state level, by the General Assembly itself, and by local school districts, and say, on a 5-year trajectory, this is where we want to bring the cost. And the way we're going to arrive at meeting those targets is through working together to make tough decisions. I'll give you an example, and you know, I'm not sure whether this would hold water when it's evaluated, but I think that school districts ought to be asked to calculate over a timeline, let's say 5 years, what they believe their staff attrition is going to be. And then through the work of the school boards and the administration, manage toward that rate of attrition, because the main cost of our delivery system, and I was alluding to this when I talked about our infrastructure and the number of people we employ at, you know, sort of middle income levels on a national comparison. I think we should try to figure out a way to employ fewer people and pay them more and still bring down the rate of growth. Former Education Commissioner Ray McNulty, who was, you know, in the early 2000s, he was the Commissioner of Education. He had a saying which was, you can have anything you want, you just can't have everything you want. And when Megan Roy says there's a lot of third rails, that's illustrative of the point that there's a lot of people who in combination are trying to have everything that they want.
No.
And I'm not sure that we can hang on to that because, and when I made my point about universal school meals, PCBs, and pre-K education, those were highly aspirational. They fueled and were fueled by interests within the education system that had sort of a niche view, environmentalism, early education, or child nutrition. General Assembly accepted, endorsed, and approved those policies. They came with a cost. And I don't think we can do that anymore. I think we have to figure out a way to tighten our belt and do it in a way that most people agree.
Yeah.
And that requires leadership, not rhetorical leadership, practical and functional leadership on the part of state leaders and district leaders, top to bottom.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming today. This half hour went so
It goes-
fast.
yeah,
And
flew
you,
by.
as always, you have really good concrete ideas for people to chew on. And I think that's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And that's it for another episode of Sharpe Takes and a look at public education in Vermont. Thanks for watching.